Welcome to the second part of our Fall Risk Conference webcast. Thank you for joining us today. By way of reminder, the Utah State Bar has approved 5 hours of continuing legal education for this conference. For those attending both sessions, the credit can be found by registering your bar number at riskconference.net. Also, please submit questions for the presenters through the feature GoToWebinar, and those will be addressed during the session. Our first speaker today is Malena Murray, who is the Director of Human Resources at the City of West Jordan. Malena holds a bachelor's degree in speech communication and a master's degree in human resource management and development. The coronavirus pandemic has presented many new challenges in our workplaces. Malena will provide insight into the challenges facing employers and in the world of COVID-19. Thank you, Malena.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Daryl had mentioned, my name is Malena Murray. I am the Human Resources Director for the City of West Jordan. I'm very excited and honored to present some very current topics with some very real-life examples, feedback, research that I've received from individuals I work with, professional peers, colleagues, individuals in other organizations, as well as employees, about the challenges we're facing and how we can move forward together to work in a very positive way to get through these challenges that may be ongoing, may be a new way of working. Over the next 45 minutes, I will discuss perspectives. I'm going to talk about some reoccurring themes, as I mentioned, from individuals, from frontline employees up to executive leaders and HR professionals.
It looks like you're muted right now.
Okay, I apologize for that. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. I was saying, you can see this quote up here from Plato: necessity is the mother of invention. I don't think that could be more truer today. I think many of us found ourselves having to be very creative in the way we go about working, the way we go about doing our everyday tasks and lives, not just professionally, but also personally. One of the things I think we needed to think about too is when this all started back in March, it wasn't just about working remote. We were also faced with, a few days after going remote, of a natural disaster, which was an earthquake. I think many of us can remember that was a lot more stress that added to the change in how we began our work lives. According to some HR executives, the global COVID-19 pandemic has presented serious mental, physical, and financial complications to people everywhere. Organizations now have to rely more than ever on their human resources departments to ensure their workforce feel as safe as possible during this unprecedented and unpredictable time. It can't be more true today that HR truly plays a crucial role to ensure employees can do their jobs effectively and efficiently. They need support, they need the tools, they need the training to how they do their job. Excuse me, face-to-face interaction is very different than it was 6 months ago. Our face-to-face is through a monitor, it's through a screen. And it's very important that we rely on human resources to help us and help our employees to be very well prepared for these challenges that we're facing. For many of us, the transition from working from home in the office, it was immediate. Think about that. It was as long as 72 hours. Some of us had 48, and some of us had as little as 24 hours. I remember as a leadership team at the City of West Jordan, we started to consider what is going to be our plan. We had about a week where we started to think, hey, some of this pandemic is going to hit pretty quickly. What employees can work from home? What employees can work in the office? Which jobs can be done remote? Which jobs can be done in the office? I remember personally as an HR professional and talking to my peers at other cities and in other industries, asking, well, how are you planning for your own department to actually make this transition and help slow the spread? And some of the feedback was very similar to what I had thought. Well, we'll do a staggered work schedule. We'll do a flex work schedule, meaning one day you're in the office, one day you're working remote. And that way we're minimizing contact not only with your peers, but with those that you come in contact with as customers, residents, employees. And I had that plan done on a Friday, had it in motion on a Monday, and by mid-Monday afternoon, that plan was scrapped. It was, things are changing very quickly. We need to work remotely. And you need to pack up your stuff and be out of the office because this is actually hitting and it's more serious than we all expected. I remember reaching out to IT. I remember other departments reaching out to IT. Well, we have to get laptops. We actually had desktops and monitors. We can't be taking all of that home. That's a lot of equipment to take so quickly. So up here you see on the screen, I have 3 challenges. These were 3 reoccurring themes that came up in my research and in my discussion with others. You might ask yourself, well, why is communication number 2? Communication should be at the forefront. That should be number 1. I also thought the same as well, but as I started to have more in-depth conversations with those that I worked with, those that I supervised, employees on the front line, HR professional peers and other organizations, and even as far east as the Washington, D.C. area, what I found was, think about how we communicate. We communicate through technology. Yes, we have face-to-face interaction, but a lot of times we send a text. We send a chat through IM. We make a call. We may use video conferencing. So technology really was the number 1 theme that was a challenge. Do we have the technology to do our jobs? Working from home one day may not be such a concern, but when suddenly it is every work day of the work week, it can pose a challenge. Equipment was something that not only did I hear from the city, but I heard from other organizations and from other peers is, well, we could use our phone as a quick way to communicate if it's a smartphone, but what about a Surface? What about laptops? So reaching out to other leaders within the organization, say, do you have extra laptops? We need to get those ready and prepared to work from home. And the accessibility, think about it. Does everyone really have internet at home? We may, but we may not have the most fastest way to communicate. Some of us may not have internet. Do we have a hotspot? Do we use our phone? So these are some really real, true, current challenges that each one of us were facing, is getting the right equipment and making sure we have that accessibility. The other thing that leads us to is what I had mentioned is our second theme, which was communication. One of the things that we needed to think about was the trust in our employees. I had heard from employees directly, I don't know if so-and-so trusts me to do my job. I know I can do it. I don't know if I can sit at a computer by myself all day in a room and do my job. So this was not just something that we as leaders had concerns about, but us as employees working. Can I actually sit at a desk or with my computer for 8+ hours a day? When I'm in the office, I can get up, I can go talk to someone, I can stretch my legs. That was a serious question that came up. Additionally with that was the informal connections and check-ins. We may not have had established regular meetings. Yes, you might go in and ask a question. You might stop by somebody's desk or in their office and ask them work-related questions. But they were irregular. And sometimes you might go days without talking to individuals. So these were some real challenges that as employees and as leaders, we all faced. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges that I don't think a lot of us were prepared for was dealing with emotions, the emotions of our employees. Ask yourself, how well do you know your employees? Think about it. Think about their home life. Are they a single parent? Do they live alone? Do they have child care issues? Do they have elder care concerns? There's blended families. Many of us come to work, not just to work, but to have that social interaction with those around us. And suddenly we don't have that. So that was something we had to deal with, is how do you manage those emotions, the stress, the anguish? Think about those first few days and maybe first few weeks. I remember actually talking to a peer of mine several states away, and then talking to a leader and talking to an employee, and I said, how's it going working from home? And I kept hearing the same response. I am in meetings all day long from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. One meeting ends, the next one starts. I don't know how I'm going to get my job done because meeting. My day keeps filling up with meetings. I can't even have 10 seconds to get up and stretch my legs. I think we were all thinking, this is the way we work remote. Let's make sure we're connecting, having a meeting, talking about the plan, what we need to get done, but we actually didn't have the time to get this done. And that was a real concern that many of us faced. And I remember some of us thought, wow, this is great to work remote. I will be able to concentrate. I can get so much work done. And then suddenly our days were filled with meeting after meeting. And then the questions started to come up. I remember employees reaching out. I remember peers reaching out to me. And as leaders would reach out and say, they're having second thoughts about the remote work. They were excited about it, but it's not what they expected. And we don't know how long this is going to go on. So these are some real challenges emotionally that employees, supervisors, organizations were dealing with as far as communication. And then we moved to our third theme, which is adaptability. We had to learn how to do work differently. And the big question was, how long is this work arrangement going to last? Is it temporary? I remember asking my supervisor and asking the leader of the organization, well, how long do you think this is going to go on? A couple of weeks? This was mid-March. And we thought, oh, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe till the end of April. April came along, April 1st came along, and it was not a joke. The follow-up was, I think this is actually going to go till June 1, maybe June 30th. And here we are 6 months later into this temporary work arrangement. Here we are in September, and we've seen in the news where some large organizations are extending the remote work now until the end of January, or as long as June 30th of 2021. So this temporary work arrangement is suddenly changing. It is very, very different than all of us expected. And then that leads us to coverage concerns. A lot of conversations and comments that were made was, don't get used to this. You're going to have to be available. Since you're working from home, you're going to have to work from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. or from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We need you available. Got to make sure that you're working. Got to make sure you're online. But who's going to be available where, we took as much as we could temporarily with technology. And for those that may go into the office once in a while or maybe once a week, or those individuals that actually had to be in the office, coverage concerns came up. And one of the more very basic questions that we might ask ourselves is, that's a really simple solution, was who's going to fill up the paper in the printer? I don't have a printer at home. I can print to the office. I'll pick those up once a week. That was a concern. What about a calling tree? When we're in the office, we think about, well, if the phone rings, it'll have a rotation, but it's a lot different when we're in a remote setting. Do we have coverage? Who answers the phone? These are very basic concerns that we never even thought about when we were in the office. And suddenly a very simple task actually was a challenge to all of us. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we move forward with this? How do we have a plan utilizing HR, and how can HR help us and help our employees so we can do our jobs effectively? We have to think differently. We have to change the way we look at work. So here I have up on the screen where we have the same 3 themes. How do we address the challenge? How do we work with these areas, not just professionally, but personally? So with technology, we need to stay connected. We need to make sure that we have the use of, as we see here today, we are having a conference through video. It's a virtual conference. It is not gathering in an actual space where we can interact live. We are interacting through technological means. Understanding how to use the video features, how to understand to use GoToWebinar, Zoom, WebEx. We have those available at the city, but never really needed to use it when we were in the office, because we could have a meeting, go into a meeting space and connect. If somebody wasn't available, they could dial in. We never really thought about how to use video chat. And now here we are, we're all using video chat. So we need to make sure that we understand the difference between, maybe instead of a phone call when you're working remote, is how about having a video call? How about a video chat versus text? These are some great ways to help you as an employee stay connected with your peers, as well as with leaders and with other individuals, is use those video features. It is a great way to stay connected. Then we move to communication. Trust your employees. Believe they want to do their job. They do want to do their job. They will do their job effectively. One of the things I had found is, I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges of working remote was there were meetings all day long. And you felt, I can't even do my job because I'm in meetings quite a bit. And so one of the things that I started to see after about a month is we eased up on the meetings. Not that the meetings weren't important, but we realized we can have our regular meetings and believe that we can work on those tasks, those projects, and then follow up. You might think to yourself, I'm actually more connected now than I had been when I'm in the office, because it's a necessity. Remember the quote from Plato, where necessity is the mother of invention. We had to be creative. We had to believe these are ways to communicate. One thing that I think was very important, and I'm hoping that each and every one of you saw this from communication from your organization, was the use of the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. It was great where our carriers stepped up right away, and instead of making just a call, sending out communication, hey, we have this virtual event, we can have virtual calls, and rolling that out to our employees. I took an initiative to make sure, hey, let's make sure our employees know they're not in this alone. It is tough for all of us. Rolling out that communication and letting them know they can and they should use the EAP. The EAP was actually used quite a bit when the pandemic hit. So make sure you have that use of the EAP. Another thing that we saw that was different too was taking a look at our benefits, in the sense that our carriers have been provided telecommunications, where instead of actually going to a doctor and having to make an appointment, how about having a video doctor appointment for the common cold and getting medication, trying to understand what was truly going on. This was a great way that we could help slow the spread and still have that quick contact with a physician to help us with our medical needs. This is something that I think we will continue to see more, and this actually will be the norm for the future, is the teledoc, the teleconferencing, the video conferencing, and the accessibility, not just between the 8 to 5, 9 to 5 workday, but after hours. We have after hour clinics. Now we have after hour video calls. And then we take a look at establishing schedules. I think it's very important to establish schedules with your team. Know who works when. Post that. You might think, well, our hours are 8 to 5. Well, who goes to lunch? When do they go to lunch? When do they take a break? Maybe now with the accessibility of remote work, we have to take a look at coverage maybe earlier in the day to a little bit later in the day to be accessible to those departments that have odd work schedules. So that's one thing to think about, is establish schedules with your team, with your department, and communicate that out, not just within your team and department, but communicate it to your organization. Do a campaign. I'm actually working on a campaign internally with my HR department in the city to have the schedule and the accessibility, know how to get in touch with human resources when we are not physically in the office. So that's something to think about. And then taking a look at meetings. I had mentioned previously that a challenge was, well, we really didn't have regular meetings. It was very informal. I could go days without talking to someone. Think about establishing regular, weekly, bi-weekly, bi-monthly meetings, one-on-one with your individual employees, maybe having a team or department meeting. That is so important, so they feel connected, and keep them abreast of what's going on. Talk about projects for the week. I can't tell you how important it has been where we have team meetings. We actually have a mayor's cabinet meeting every Tuesday, and that is so important, where you see the individuals that you don't see regularly because you're not in the office, and talking about very important themes that are going on, what's going on in your department, how it affects the city. And I can't tell you how important is those 2 hours are every Tuesday. And we actually did a survey trying to get a pulse from our employees of how they're feeling from working remote. And it was really great feedback where they felt, wow, the city really stepped up to help us have the tools we needed to work remote. But out of that survey, what was so important was those meetings of having connection where, like I said, you're not seeing someone physically face to face, but having that video conference. So think about establishing those meetings. It's really important. One thing that also is important with establishing schedules is encourage your employees to maybe have a break together, in the sense that, hey, I log off, or I put that I'm on break, and they communicate with another peer employee where they have maybe a 10-minute break and they're video chatting. How are things going? How are you feeling? That is a great way for them to continue that social interaction that they don't have regularly in the office. Or they could have lunch with another peer. Hey, we've heard about date night through apps. We've heard about family night through apps. What about lunch with a coworker? Encourage that, where they're eating lunch and they're talking about, well, how was your weekend? Have you seen that latest movie that now is streaming versus going to the movies? So those are some great ways that you can help your employees have the interaction. And then we look at our third theme, which is adaptability. It's really important that we take a look at what once seemed to be temporary is actually now possibly semi-permanent or permanent for some roles. Think about, as over the 6 months, what worked, what didn't work, what positions could actually work remote versus in the office. I know with our IT department, it's great, because a lot of times when you are interacting with your IT department, they just get into your computer. They say, hey, I'm going to remote in. Let's see what the connectivity issue. I just had that this morning, and it was great. At 7 a.m., I could call someone in IT didn't need to be in the office. And I said, hey, I've got some issues. I can't see my screen. I've got a presentation coming up in about an hour and a half. I need some help here. And it was great to have IT be able to get in there and resolve the issue. So there are some departments that can work remote. So think about that remote work arrangement. And then if you're thinking about, I've seen where some cities are now having a plan to phase in. We've actually talked about it as a leadership team just this week. Let's think about a plan to transition, or what positions can transition to remote work to work in the office. So it's getting us thinking. You know, we've had to tell an employee, hey, you've got 24 hours and you got to start working from home. Do we want to tell them in 24 hours you have to get back into the office? Think about all of those outside factors that played into them when they were having to make the adjustment to work remote. Well, you know, I have some kids that are in school, so picking them up. I don't have childcare because they've shut down. I have elderly care. I've had to adjust my life and my schedule to deal with these outside factors so I can also be committed and get my job done. So these are some things that we need to think about. I actually talked to an individual that worked for a large organization here in Utah, and they are coming up with a plan where we're going to start it off of 2 days in the office and then 3 days remote. We're going to try that for about 8 weeks, and then we're going to assess from that point how we transition those individuals that need to get back into the office. Think about that. It was an emotional stress for all of us, and now we have to make the change to come back into the office if our position truly needs to be back in the office. One recommendation, and we actually had our city attorney's office do this yesterday, is they actually had a lunch. They invited back all of their employees and say, you know, it's been 6 months, we've all been working remote. This is an excellent opportunity for us to meet. We're gonna practice social distancing, but let's have lunch. And I had talked to a few employees from that department, and the glow on their face, the response, the reaction, it was really nice to get in the office and interact with my peers that I haven't seen in almost 6 months. And that might be something to think about. Do a once a month, a quarterly lunch, or a quarterly meeting, a once a month meeting, where you can get your group back in the office. Think about that social interaction and how it impacts positively the communication and how we continue to do our jobs. So that is something that we want to think about, is how do we be flexible in a new way of how we work. And then finally up here I have training. It's really important that we make sure we have training set up. We provide that training. I actually had an employee who had come in and said, hey, you know, I'm a new supervisor. This hit back in March. Never actually was able to get some supervisor training. And I said, you know, and I actually mentioned Olympus. I said, as being a customer of Olympus, they've got some great online training, 20 to 30 minutes, up to an hour of some supervisor training, some communication training. Let me talk with your department head and let's see if we can get you set up on that, because I think that's a really good introduction to help you with supervising. Use your resources, reach out to human resources. There is accessibility, there is support. There are tools to help you and your employees do their jobs effectively. Think about how you want to move forward with video chat. So these are some training questions that may come up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our next slide of how to look forward as we continue in this challenging world with COVID. Be sure to think about establishing rules. What are your expectations now that we are either in a permanent, semi-permanent, a transition phase of coming back into the office? What are your expectations? Are you talking with your employees and getting feedback from them? Like I said earlier, we did a survey, got some great feedback, but then following up on that feedback. So let's think about strategic initiatives. What are the next steps? So up here, I have a few bullets where I think are some very key points. This was some information that I received in direct discussion and some research, and then looking at some HR professional research as well that seems to be very similar to the things that we as an organization and globally are thinking about how we look forward to continue doing business. You really want to support the mental health of your employees. I mentioned the EAP, expand those resources. A lot of times when we think about EAP, we think about counseling. There is so much more to an EAP. As you take a look at your budget planning, as you take a look at your benefits, and I have revamped the benefits package as number 3, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that, those benefits. But think about the expansion of your EAP. It's not just about counseling. It's saying, hey, you know what? I had a pipe burst. I don't know how to find a plumber. I can contact the EAP, and they have some resource directly in the city I live in where they are reputable plumbers, and I can contact, and then they can do the work. Obviously, that's a cost for employee, but that resource can be part of your EAP. So it is more than that. I'm going out of town. I don't know who I can have or where I can take my pet. Contact the EAP. There are pet services. Hey, this has a great rating. We have feedback directly from other employees at other locations. You may want to contact the EAP and get some information on pet sitting. So an EAP is no longer just about counseling. There are so many services to take a look at with your EAP. So think about that as you take a look at your benefits. Another thing we want to think about is update policy, stay current, communicate with your employees. I remember as soon as the COVID hit, we as a leadership team, specifically our city attorney's office and human resources and administrative services, had to come up with an FMLA COVID policy, a direct executive order communication from our mayor. It was a very stressful time. We were able to do it, but we had to make sure that we were in compliance with the Department of Labor and letting our employees know, hey, if you are symptomatic, here's what is available to you. Here is the benefit. Think about the policy. Do you have a remote policy? A flex work arrangement policy? More and more organizations are now creating and implementing a remote policy. If you don't have one, this is an excellent time as we take a look at the permanent to semi-permanent and phased-in approach to make sure that we have a policy in place and communicating that to our employees. Transparency is key. Don't have surprises. And if you don't know, it is okay to say, I don't. Let's look into that. Let's get the information. We want to make sure you feel that you have the information, the tools, the resources to do your job. And as I mentioned, here you see a third bullet, revamp your benefits package. Think about what's changed over the last 6 months. What hasn't been used so much with your benefits? What has been used more? You know, think about, it's not just childcare, but now it is elder care benefits, wellness days. Hey, we want to recognize you with not a sick day, but a wellness day. Take this wellness day to enjoy time for you to focus on you and your health in a positive way. Think about maybe implementing volunteer days, offering maybe 8 hours a year where we don't have that social interaction in the office, but how about, hey, I want to go and volunteer a day with a charity that's near and dear to my heart or my family, or help build a home. We know that there's quite a bit of charities out there. So think about how you revamp your benefits package. Those are some significant things to think about as it's coming up on that budget year and you're taking a look at the new benefits plan year. And then here, this has been eye-opening for many organizations that I have spoken to, direct HR professionals, and even with our own organization, is redesign your recruitment plan. No longer are we having face-to-face interviews, but we may do the initial pre-screen, the first round interview, and even the final interview through a video interview. I personally had hired someone, had never met them directly, but all through video conferencing. You might tell yourself, wow, that's unheard of. That I would have probably said that a year ago or maybe even 6 months ago. But with the way the world has changed, it was amazing to have the convenience, the opportunity to interview and to make the decision and hire the individual all through video conferencing. Never ever met the individual face to face until their actual date of hire. Think about, do you really need to recruit locally? Can you hire a position that can work remote in another state? Setting the expectation of, hey, once a quarter, I need you to come into the office. Things are changing. We can expand how we look for qualified individuals, not just locally, but regionally or domestically. And then finally, my fourth bullet is nix that 9 to 5 workday. Now that we have the opportunity to be remote, think about the departments at the city. We have public safety, we have public works. They are not on a 9 to 5 work schedule. So why do we always need to be on a 9 to 5 work schedule? With human resources, we're expanding our hours, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., helping the public safety and public works that start their shifts early. Think about how you want to be accessible to your employees. And then lastly, this is a very real question that has come up. Rethink cost of living differences for pay in a remote world. It's going to change. Do you give the same percentage increase to everyone? But if you have an employee that lives in Washington, D.C., and that is where the home base is, and they're coming into the office, you might take a look at cost of living differently or your yearly increases. Obviously, this is going to take collaboration, communication, taking a look at your budget, but thinking differently. Forget about the phrase, but that's how we always did it, because that's how we always did it, just doesn't work today. But I would say, as you move forward, please make sure that you partner with human resources. We are here for you. We can help you. And it is going to be challenging, but together we can work together to help our employees have those resources and the organization to be successful. And I think it's time for questions.
All right. We've got a couple of questions that came in. Let me read those off to you. First one is, do you foresee a time when many positions will stay permanently working remote? And if so, will you adjust workstations in the office to have temporary places where they can occasionally come in for work?
Great question. Absolutely, yes. That's actually a very, very real discussion I have actually had with my direct supervisor and with administration, that we are going to have positions that will go permanent remote. And then how does that free up space in the office? And so what we had talked about was having a kiosk or a cubicle and having the days rotated, where if that person comes into office, maybe their day is on a Wednesday, they use that same office. And then obviously somebody else that is in the same position will go into the office and use that same office. So a work share location or work share office, absolutely. It's a great way to free up space as we now take a look at having more conference space available or video conferencing, as that is now the norm.
Great. Another question that came in is, how do you prevent employee burnout when many will be accessible beyond a normal workday?
Another really good question. I think what would be really helpful is setting those expectations. Yes, it's really easy to get online at 6 o'clock in the morning, or, hey, I'm home, I don't have to spend that hour driving into the office. I can spend that hour working on this project or responding to this request. Set expectations as a supervisor. Hey, we've got your schedule established. At this time, it's time to log off. that work will be available tomorrow. Prioritize making sure you have that video connection with your employees, having those regular team meetings, and encouraging your peers to also have interaction through, hey, let's take a break together through video chat. But I think what really it comes down to is set clear expectations so the employee doesn't feel obligated to be online and they have that opportunity. It's time to digress. Work is over for the day.
All right. Jared Smith wants to know where your ostrich went.
It is still there on the wall, Jared. I thought it would be appropriate to have a more neutral background, so I had to shift my computer around.
Well, we really appreciate your presentation. Very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Milena. That was excellent. Our next presenter will be David Lund. David is an Assistant Attorney General with the state of Utah and works within the state's Risk Management Division, managing claims and defending state agencies, as well as school districts, charter schools, and higher education, colleges and universities. David is a graduate of Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School. And David will be presenting on large liability claim trends that are impacting both the state as well as the educational institutions. And really, I think that's applicable to all of us in government throughout the state, those trends that are impacting us. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, David.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to present. I hope my presentation is my PowerPoint up. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can see it right in front of us.
Okay, good. I appreciate this. I bring greetings from Brian Nelson, who's the state risk manager. Unfortunately, he's not able to present today as he's out of town, but he asked me to do this presentation and I was glad to do it. I want to talk about several large settlements and large lawsuit verdicts that have occurred across the country and how they impact each one of us. But before I do that, I want to kind of lay some background as to why this is important to us and why we track this kind of information. To do that, I want to kind of explain a little bit about state risk management, what we do and what we are. We are a group that is created by statute. We run the State Risk Fund, which is a fund of about $40 million that we obtain through premiums that we receive from our covered entities. State Risk Management is the coverage provider for all state agencies, all of the state school districts, all higher education institutions owned by the state, and about half of the charter schools in the state are also covered through risk management. So we have an extremely broad array of covered entities that we take care of. That includes the National Guard, the State National Guard, the Utah Highway Patrol. It includes all of the correctional facilities. It includes the courts. It includes all boards and commissions created by the state. It includes the legislature itself. Basically, any entity that is part of the state is covered by state risk management. And the way our fund works is we have a self-insured retention, an SIR, of $1 million. So we pay out the first $1 million of any claims that we receive. And then we purchase excess liability and property coverage for the entities that we serve. And in the past, we have purchased $10 million worth of coverage per occurrence in excess liability. We also procure for our insureds cyber and worker compensation coverage. That's a pass-through that we handle. We also purchase things like aviation coverage for our higher education entities and institutions that have aviation programs. State risk management itself is run by the director, as I mentioned, Brian Nelson, and we have a staff of about 35 people. That includes our claims department, our loss control group, and our administrative group. We insure all of the state property, and we've added that up. It comes to a total insured value of approximately $39 billion worth of state property that we insure. So in addition to having a very broad array of entities that we insure, we also provide a broad array of coverages. We cover all employment actions against state entities. We cover, as I mentioned, through a pass-through, all the cyber concerns of the state. We cover things like federal civil rights violations, Title IX, Title VII, those kinds of claims. We provide construction coverage for all of our entities that are involved in new constructions throughout the state. We provide law enforcement coverage, aviation, workers' comp. We insure all of the state's motor pool and all of the state's other vehicles, all of their school buses. So we have not only a broad array of entities that we cover, but we also have a very broad array of coverages that we provide. One of the things that we've become concerned with in the last, several years is the fact that our payout on liability claims has increased dramatically over several years. It used to be that we would pay out approximately $10 million a year in liability payments. This was pretty constant, pretty static up until about 2015. Then that began to rapidly change. We began seeing an increase in the payouts that we were making for liability claims. We went in 2015 from a $10 million total payout to about $15 million. And
Hey, David, can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Sure.
We're getting your Teams notifications, and not sure you want to be broadcasting those.
Oh, I'm not sure how to turn that off, frankly.
Oh, I just closed the Teams app if it was me.
Oh, okay. Okay. I will do that. Hang on just one moment while I get to it.
If you right-click the one in your taskbar, you should have an option to close it.
Yeah.
So the one that's kind of glowing orange down at the bottom of the screen.
Okay. Yeah. There we go. I hope that worked.
Yeah, and then since we're here, if you go to slideshow and you can say continue from current show, we'll get a full screen view of the slide.
Where's that? I'm not very
Right where your
technologically
mouse was. So if you go to the top bar,
Yeah.
right to the, just a little more to the right, a little to the left from there, and down.
Is there a full screen or something?
Actually, just click on the slide, and then if you push F5, it should give us a full screen.
Okay. There, is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Now just forward on to where we were.
Okay. I'll just move on to the next slide. I want to kind of just continue on the theme that I was talking about. So in the last several years, about the last 5 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in our total liability payments. As I mentioned, our payments went from $10 million a year in 2014 to $15 million a year in 2015. And since that time have continued to increase to about 15 to 18, roughly $19 million a year in total liability payments. So we did some research and we came up with this graph. We found, first of all, that this wasn't unique to state risk management in Utah. We had discussions with other state risk managers and other entities for other states and found that they were experiencing the same increase in total liability payments. So we did some research and we found that in general in the United States, composite renewal rates for all liability lines were very static, if not decreasing, from 2013 through 2017. But then since then, in 2018 and through the present, have seen double-digit increases in their renewal rates since that time, and that's been consistent with our experience as well. As the slide shows, liability rates across the board have spiked since 2017 and currently are in the double digits for renewal. The way our fund works, we began in 2005 purchasing excess liability of $10 million for all of our covered entities. We paid in 2005 $250,000 for that policy. Since that time, we've seen a relatively flat increase in that charge for our excess liability up until last year. Last year, we ended up paying $574,000 for the same $10 million in coverage that we received in 2005 for $250,000. And so we looked at some of the reasons for this increase in our premium. We found that there are several reasons. One of them, I think, is kind of a general feeling that law enforcement and government are being viewed as the enemy and that they have very deep pockets. We think that's one of the trends that's taking place across the country. We also believe that there's a general perception among the public that claims against state entities are being seen as worth more now than they used to be. It used to be very rare to see a jury verdict in excess of $1 million. That was something that didn't happen very often. Now those verdicts are much more common, and verdicts are common well in excess of that, in the tens of millions of dollars. So we became concerned about what has been dubbed social inflation. This is the concept that claims are substantially increasing in value across the country. I'm sorry, I'm getting these Teams notifications again. I don't know how to turn that off. So the next slide, let's see. This slide shows the number of claims that State Risk Management has dealt with since 2012 that have exceeded $500,000 in value. And as I mentioned, our total payout is was roughly $10 million before 2015, and since then has been about $18 to $19 million. But the claims that actually exceeded $500,000, you can see each one of these colored bands is a different claim worth more than $500,000. And we've had between 2 and 7 $500,000 claims up through this year. We're concerned that this is going to increase, and we see this as a problem. We do have the benefit of having the tort caps available, so that tends to hold down some of our payments for liability claims and verdicts. But that does not apply to any civil rights actions. Anything brought in federal court is not subject to a cap. And we have in Utah some of the largest caps available in the nation now. There are some states that don't have any caps, but of the states that do have caps, we rank among the top in the amount of our caps. In fact, 33 states have caps that are lower than Utah's caps. So that's one of the things that concerns us, is the continuing attack on the jury verdict caps in the state of Utah. So despite our relatively moderate history of large claims, when we went out to renew our $10 million SIR this year, we presented our request to purchase that insurance to 27 different carriers. We received no response from 2 of those carriers. We received from 12 others a response that it was outside of their appetite, their risk appetite, that they weren't interested in providing that to us. 6 of them said that we needed to have an SIR increase from $1 million to at least $10 to $20 million before they would consider providing the coverage. And 5 of them told us they wouldn't follow the broad form coverage that Brit, who was our carrier, had provided in the past. They wouldn't provide the same levels of coverage for the same types of claims. And almost all of them told us that the premium that we were paying, which last year, as I mentioned, was more than $500,000, was too low. So we did some negotiating through our broker, and we did end up renewing our coverage with Brit. But our coverage, the SIR actually increased from $1 million to now it's $2 million for the next fiscal year. So instead of paying out the first $1 million of each claim, we'll have to pay out the first $2 million. They also decreased our annual aggregate from $10 million to $3 million, or our per claim aggregate from $10 million to $3 million, and our annual aggregate decreased from $20 million to $6 million. So we had, as I mentioned, a premium increase from $574,000 this last fiscal year to now it will be $862,000 for the coverage with the changes that I've mentioned above. So we were concerned with this. We wanted to get close to what the same coverage was that we've had in the past. We went out to the reinsurance market, and we found that Everest Re was willing to provide us a policy for a premium of $1.65 million, which we've agreed to pay. That adds another $5 million to our per occurrence limits. That adds the $6 million necessary to bring our aggregate limit to 10. And that also follows the Brit form and the retroactive dates in Brit's policy that we were concerned about. So the bottom line is we are now paying in excess of $2.5 million for roughly the same coverage that we paid $250,000 for in 2005. So we've seen an increase tenfold in the amount that we're paying for our excess policies. So this concept of social inflation is very troubling to us. We think that there's kind of a concern across the country that claims against law enforcement in particular are being viewed as worth more than they used to be. And so we started looking at some of the cases that have taken place across the country and some of the verdicts and settlements that have been reached in an effort to understand why they're increasing so rapidly. So what I want to do with my remaining time is just go over a lot of these claims. And I apologize, there are quite a few of them, but I think you'll find this interesting. I think I'm going to apologize in advance for reading some of the news reports of these, but I think it's helpful to get all of the facts straight. The first one on the list here is this 2020 case in the state of Washington that involved a wrongful death claim with a verdict of $98 million. We're all very aware of this case because it has its roots here in Utah. This is the Cox family and Josh Powell and Susan Powell matter. The jury, this case went to a jury in the state of Washington over the alleged fault of the state of Washington's Department of Child and Family Services in the deaths of Charlie and Braden Powell, the two sons of Josh and Susan Powell. As you will all recall from news reports, Josh Powell, while he was under investigation in the state of Utah in the disappearance of his wife, moved to Washington State. He ended up losing custody of his 2 boys, and the state came in and were giving him supervised visitation. And while in one of these visitations, Josh Powell ended up killing both of his sons, lighting his house on fire, and killing himself in the process. The jury was asked to consider whether the state and the Department of Family Services in the state of Washington was negligent with respect to this death. And recently, a jury verdict in the amount of $98 million was assessed by the jury in the case. After that, Charles Cox, the father of Susan Powell, said in the statement, "Nothing can bring back the boys. But this is the end of a nightmare, and it's gratifying to hear a jury tell the state they were wrong and to award a verdict that will force them to change their culture to make sure this doesn't happen to other children in the future. The interesting thing about this is the jurors found damages for each boy to be $57,500,000 for each of the two boys. They assessed $8,245,500 of those damages to Josh Powell, the person who actually committed the crime, killed the boys and himself in the process. But they found that the state was liable for the other $82 million in the verdict. After the verdict was rendered, one of the attorneys in the case said, if the state had followed its practices and its guidelines, common sense, investigated, had visitations where it was supposed to have them, none of this would have happened. An assistant attorney general for the state said in closing arguments on behalf of the state, there is no ifs, ands, or buts that this was a tragic, tragic matter, but the state took very seriously all of its obligations. They did their job, they followed their policies. So notwithstanding the fact that the state made these arguments that it had not done anything wrong, that it had not violated any of its policies, the jury saw it differently and awarded a substantial verdict, one that kind of frankly shocks the conscience as to how much this was worth. I did see on the news yesterday a news report that this verdict had actually been reduced by the trial judge following the rendering of the verdict to $33 million. So it really isn't as high on our list as it used to be. But we'll have to see what happens with the appeals of this matter, of whether or not that verdict continues in force or not. The second case on the list here is an interesting one. It involves the death of a former mayor of Cottageville, South Carolina. And I'll just read to you some of this. The family of Cottageville's former mayor, Bert Reeves, has been granted a $97.5 million award in their wrongful death lawsuit. Authorities say Mr. Reeves was shot to death by Cottageville police officer Randall Price in May of 2011. The civil suit was filed in August 2012 against the town, the police department, and the officer. The jury returned a verdict for the plaintiff on all causes of action, including municipal liability for negligent hiring against the town of Cottageville and excessive force against Officer Randall Price. The statement reads, the jury awarded $7.5 million in actual damages, $60 million in punitive damages against the town of Cottageville, and $30 million in punitive damages against Officer Randall Price. Cottageville police officials won't say what caused the shooting, only that the officer and Reeves had an altercation. The officer's attorney argued his client shot in self-defense. Attorneys for Cottageville argued the town should not be responsible for hiring an officer with a checkered past and had done nothing wrong. This apparently occurred at the officer's home while the two were involved in some sort of altercation. Notwithstanding this, the jury found that the city itself and the police department should be on the hook for this, and they actually ended up awarding 2 times the punitive damages against the city as they did against the person who actually did the shooting. So this kind of is another indication that juries are seeing state entities and local entities as deep pockets. The third case on the list here is also very interesting, and it also happened in the state of Washington. You may have recall having heard news reports about this. This involved a landslide that occurred in 2014 in the state of Washington. The news report said tragedy struck the Steelhead Haven community of Osso in Washington after weeks of rain rendered clear-cut mountainside unstable. There was no warning for residents, and they had nowhere to run as a 30 to 70 foot high wall of mud, trees, and debris slid down the mountain, burying entire families, a neighborhood, and a highway over 1 square mile of devastated ground. The Osso tragedy is the nation's largest and deadliest landslide to date. And what happened in this case is that the state And the company that were logging on the mountain above this town knew that there was some instability in the soil caused by the logging activities, but they did nothing allegedly to warn the people living below the mountain that there was a problem. When the slide happened, there was a class action settlement that was filed against both the state and the logging company. And in October 2016, given the nature of the facts that were involved, there was a settlement reached just before this case went to trial with the two defendants in the case. The state settled on the eve of trial for $50 million for its role in the tragedy. Grand Lakes Forest Association, the timber company doing the work on the mountain, agreed to pay $10 million. So the state, despite the fact that it wasn't the one that was doing the logging, ended up paying 5 times as much as the logging company itself that basically, in essence, caused this tragedy. So it's another indication that state entities are being held to a higher standard than even private companies when it comes to liability in these kinds of jury verdicts. The fourth case on this list involves a man who was beaten by law enforcement in the city of East Cleveland, Ohio. Let me just read what the news report said about that. A jury awarded $50 million to an East Cleveland man who filed a lawsuit that said police in that city beat him while he was in handcuffs in 2012, then locked him in a concrete storage room for 4 days with no food or restroom. The award came after the second jury trial in the case of Arnold Black, after an appeals court last year overturned a previous award of $22 million. So there was a previous award in this case of $22 million. The state appealed it. They had a new trial and it came back at $50 million. So I guess the moral of the story here is be careful what you wish for. The jury awarded $20 million in compensatory damages and $30 million in punitive damages against the city of East Cleveland. And this was said to be one of the largest civil awards, civil rights violations in the state of Ohio. Of course, Mr. Black, the plaintiff in the case, was elated, as you would assume he would be. Black sued the department after his 2012 arrest after 2 officers stopped his truck. One officer testified that the other officer ordered him to stop Black's truck, and he did, even though he knew there was no probable cause to do so. One officer thought Black's truck resembled a truck of a man suspected of dealing drugs, and he tore through the truck but never found any illegal materials. The officer questioned Black about drug dealing activities and punched him in the face when Black couldn't give him any information. The officer testified at the second trial, just as he did in the first in 2016, that the department had a practice of roughing up suspects to get them to talk. Black said he spent several days locked up in a room with no toilet and was forced to urinate in a locker. Police gave Black 1 carton of milk during his 5 days of captivity. Prosecutors dropped the drug charges against Black a month later. So you can see this was some relatively egregious facts that resulted in an extremely large verdict against the city of East Cleveland. The fifth case on the list here is also a case that comes out of the state of Washington again. This really isn't against a governmental entity. It's against a hospital and a lab, but we thought it was interesting because it involves a quasi-governmental entity, the hospital. This was a $50 million jury verdict. The King County jury awarded a Burien couple the largest ever individual amount in the history of the state of Washington, $50 million. This was before the landslide case took place, I guess, because now that's bigger. But the award is for a birth defect case in which the jury concluded that Valley Medical Center in Renton and Lab Corporation of America were negligent in the handling of a prenatal genetic test for the couple's son. The test, conducted at Valley Medical Center and evaluated by LabCorp, failed to reveal any abnormalities in the fetus, even though chromosomal defect evaluation was the express purpose of the test. With the absence of proper instructions, the test came back normal and the couple continued with the pregnancy. The couple's son was born with severe mental and physical disabilities. The jury concluded that if genetic testing had been handled correctly, it would have detected that the fetus had a chromosomal defect. With this result, the couple would have terminated the pregnancy. And so again, a negligence claim that results in a verdict of more than $50 million in a single incident involving a single person. The sixth case on the list here is a case involving the city of Chicago. A man, Michael Laporta, was awarded $44.7 million after a federal grand jury determined Chicago police officers shot him in the head after a night of heavy drinking. The attorneys for Laporta called it the largest verdict ever reached in Chicago for a police misconduct lawsuit. Laporta is disabled after he was shot in the back of the head in 2010. Laporta was at his friend's home, an off-duty Chicago police officer named Patrick Kelly, when the officer's gun went off. Kelly claimed Laporta tried to commit suicide, but the jury didn't buy it. Instead, the jury believed that there was kind of a code of silence that was going on between the officer and not telling the truth about what happened in the incident. Bill McCaffrey, the city's law department, responded, "We are disappointed in the jury's verdict, and as we argued in the case, taxpayers should not be responsible for an off-duty officer's purely private actions." The jury, however, did not see this as a private issue, especially when Officer Kelly called 911. You represent the police because you made the call, and when you made the call, you said, "I'm a police officer." So you knew that the weight of what you did was in your position, because you wouldn't need to tell someone you were a police officer if it was a private matter, the plaintiff's attorney argued. So despite the fact that this officer was off duty, that the two were together at his home when the shooting occurred, the jury concluded that the officer was, in essence, acting in his course and scope of employment, and was the city and the police department were responsible for the shooting of this man. Laporta is now in a wheelchair and requires 24 hours care. Laporta's lawyers argued the city was responsible because its police department retained Kelly despite multiple allegations about his aggressive behavior before the 2010 shooting. So again, one individual in a police law enforcement verdict that received almost $50 million, the largest ever in the state of Illinois at the time. The seventh case here is a similar case against Baltimore, involved a law enforcement verdict of $37 million. A jury returned a verdict Friday of more than $37 million against Baltimore County, Maryland, in a civil lawsuit brought by the family and estate of a woman killed in an armed standoff with county police. The woman's name was Corinne Grimes. In August 2016, after an hours-long standoff with police in Baltimore County, she was trying to live stream the encounter with police, authorities said at the time. She and her son Cody, age 5, were both shot during the incident. We hope this sends a message. This is the attorney for Ms. Gaines. We hope this sends a message to all police officers across the country that the citizens are tired of the police abusing their rights and abusing the citizenry. During the trial, the plaintiff argued that the force was excessive because the shot that the officer took was unnecessary and unreasonable because the officers were all safe in the location where they were located. According to the Baltimore Sun, throughout the course of the trial, attorneys for Baltimore County and Officer Royce Ruby argued that the officer reasonably feared he or others could have been injured or killed by Gaines, who was armed with a gun. So this is a situation where an armed standoff with someone who had a gun, who was threatening police and actually trying to stream the incident on social media, ended up getting $37 million from the county and the police department. According to the Gaines family, Maryland has caps on governmental liability, but the caps did not apply to federal constitutional claims under 42 USC 1983. That's the same here in Utah. Our caps don't apply to any federal claims. If this were to happen in the state of Utah, we'd be in the same position where we would not have any caps available to us. The 8th case on the list here is a sexual molestation case that comes from Mount Vernon, New York in 2011. A woman with special needs won a $24 million lawsuit 7 years after she was allegedly raped as a Mount Vernon high school student. And the essence of this case is this girl rode the school bus to school every day, but at some point the school determined that she would be better off riding home on a county bus line than she would on a school bus. She did this for a period of time until her family found out, and they contacted the school and said they did not want her riding a private bus line home from school, but they wanted her on the school bus. The report says her family found out and alerted the school district they wanted her on the school bus. On December 19, 2011, though, she did not go home on the school bus. Instead, she went home with an older boy who raped her at his home, according to the lawsuit. She told her family about the assault, but she was unable to identify the attacker, who has never been discovered, her lawyer said. And then this goes on to claim how she was so terribly and traumatically, understandably, affected by this rape that occurred. The attorney for this girl said, "This verdict, what we believe to be the largest sexual assault verdict in New York history, is a message loud and clear to every company, to every school district, and to every school district, that for them to now say we did not do the sexual assault, we are not responsible, is not acceptable." The jury made this finding of negligence against the state only and found that the bus company was not negligent with respect to what happened. So again, a single molestation case resulting in a $28 million verdict, with the school's only involvement being allowing this girl to ride home from school on a non-school bus vehicle. The 9th case here is also a transit system case that occurred in Nevada. On July 29, 2011, Harvey Chernikoff, a 51-year-old mentally disabled man, choked to death on a sandwich while riding a paratransit vehicle for the handicapped in Las Vegas, Nevada. The bus driver did not stop Chernikoff from eating, even though the bus system had rules against eating and drinking on the bus. In addition, First Transit required its drivers to scan interior mirrors every 5 seconds while driving. Although Chernikoff was the only passenger on the bus at the time of the incident, the driver failed to notice that Chernikoff was slowly choking to death behind him. Chernikoff's parents, Jack and Elaine Chernikoff, filed an action against Nevada Transit System in the Nevada District Court for Clark County. The plaintiffs asserted claims of negligence, respondeat superior, as well as punitive damages and negligent hiring and retention and supervision. The defendants in this case made a $100,000 offer of judgment, which was declined by the plaintiffs. The defendants made the $100 offer of judgment that was declined by the plaintiffs prior to the case going to trial. The jury reached a verdict in the plaintiffs' favor, awarding them a reported $15 million for the family's loss of Harvey, along with his pain and suffering that he endured before he died. The jury returned the verdict following 30 minutes of deliberation. So again, a huge verdict with somewhat tenuous liability on the part of the Nevada Transit System. The 10th case here is an award against the Los Angeles Police Department. It was a $24 million verdict. This is an extremely troubling case, at least to me, because this was a 13-year-old boy who was playing with an airsoft gun that looked like a real gun. He and his friends were out playing in the streets after dark with these replica guns, these airsoft pistols. and somebody called the police, and the police responded and went to the scene. One of the police came around the side of the building, and the boy was standing there with a gun and tried to make a move towards the police officer. The police officer, understandably, thinking he was confronting an individual with a gun, shot and killed the boy. The jury found that this was an excessive use of force by the Los Angeles Police Department officer, and they awarded the family of the boy $24 million in damages. Interestingly, the officer was cleared of any wrongdoing by the police commission. The commission concluded that the replica was indistinguishable from a real firearm, and that reasonably any officer in similar circumstances would be focused on the threat posed by the weapon and would not see the red tip on the end of the gun. LA Chief of Police Charlie Beck said in a statement Friday that he's been seeking legislation that would require makers of replica guns to better distinguish them from regular guns. So again, this is a huge verdict in a case where an officer did nothing more than respond to the threat of somebody with a gun looking at him. The attorney for the city said, "This is a tragedy for all involved, but in particular for the young man injured in this police shooting and for the officer who believed he was protecting himself and his partner from the real threat. The replica gun the boy had was indistinguishable from a real handgun on a dark night. When our officers are confronted with a realistic replica weapon in the field, they have to react in a split second to the perceived threat. If our officers delay or don't respond, suspects could lose their lives." Let's see, I went forward. There are just three more here. I'll go over them very briefly. The 11th one on the list here is a $45.4 million verdict. This was a 15-year-old girl who endured sexual abuse at the home of her mother and four men who were living with them. Social workers were alleged, Los Angeles County social workers were alleged to have reasonable suspicion that the girl was being molested, but failed to inform authorities. The interesting thing about this is the jury verdict after deliberations for 4.5 hours was that the county's liability was at 45% or $20.6 million. They delegated another 45% to the child's mother, who was living with the four men at the time, and only 10% collectively for the four male perpetrators of the sexual abuse. So again, it's a clear indication that state entities are being seen as deep pockets when 90% of the fault for this sexual abuse was appropriated to the mother and the county, and only 10% to the actual perpetrators. The 12th one on here is in the state of Wisconsin against their Department of Corrections. It was a suicide situation where a 16-year-old was remanded to youth prison for breaking into a store and stealing alcohol. She found herself alone in the cell at the Copper Lake School for Girls on November 9, 2015, and turned on her call light to get the attention of the staff. The guards on duty were required to respond to the call light as soon as possible, but failed to do so. One employee, a youth counselor, admitted that he saw the light but decided to take the trash out before checking on Briggs. She was later found hanging in her cell from a t-shirt that she had used to attempt to commit suicide. She ended up having severe mental issues following this. She was revived by the staff when she was found, but ended up cognitively impaired. In this case, against the the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, the jury awarded, actually no, this was a settlement that was awarded of $18.9 million for the failure of the Department of Corrections to follow its policies regarding the care and custody of inmates. After the verdict, it was concluded the $18.9 million settlement. The state's insurers paid around $14.9 million of it. And attorney's fees and costs in the case totaled approximately $7.5 million. The 13th case on the list here is a case in San Diego Superior Court, a $12 million jury verdict. A man was drunk and disorderly. Some citizens called 911, and both San Diego County Sheriff's Department and healthcare workers responded to the scene. And healthcare workers were attempting to assess the man's condition, and found that he was having some sort of a problem. And instead of allowing the healthcare workers to do what they needed to do, the police officers took the man into custody and took him to jail. He later ended up falling in the jail and suffering a brain bleed, and so that compounded the problem. And this is what the news report said. Collins, a 30-year-old welder from Carlsbad, was suffering from a serious sodium deficiency that caused him to become disoriented and slur his speech, according to the lawsuit. He left home on the night of November 18, 2016, after experiencing repeated hallucinations. A pedestrian saw Collins stumble and fall to the ground and called 911. Paramedics responded, but before they could complete their evaluation, sheriff's deputies arrived and determined the man was under the influence of alcohol and booked him into the Vista jail, according to the trial testimony. Collins fell inside the jail and suffered a brain bleed, further exacerbating his condition, court records said. Hours passed before he received medical attention, but by then the amount of sodium in his blood had declined to near fatal levels, documents show. Collins will need medical supervision for the rest of his life. He is able to walk and speak, but he struggles to perform routine tasks, his lawyer said. The sheriffs issued a statement, and they said it was believed that the $12.6 million verdict pushed the total amount of settlements and damage awards against this entity to $20 million in the past 10 years. In the prior decade, the San Diego County had paid out $1.9 million to resolve all such claims. So in a one decade period, they saw a tenfold increase in the number of payouts because of these sorts of Department of Corrections lawsuits. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip the last case. It's a Michigan case that involves a $12 million settlement for a situation where a youth was driving an ATV and was shot by an officer with a taser and ended up crashing and killing himself in that. But the bottom line, as you can see from all of these cases, is that we're very concerned about social inflation. We see it as a problem, not necessarily in Utah, but a problem that is affecting rates for liability insurers across the board. We see it as something that's going to continue to be problematic, and we think it's something that every insurance professional needs to be concerned about. I'd be happy to take any questions you have about any of this, but in essence, that completes my presentation.
All right, thanks, David. Yeah, got a few questions that have come in. First one is, could you discuss the risks the state may face for punitive damages? Yeah,
we're not too concerned about that on a state level because the statute, the Governmental Immunity Act, precludes any punitive damages awards against any state entities. But in the federal courts, that doesn't apply. So we do have concerns about punitive damages in federal civil rights violations cases that take place in federal court. It's similar to what other states are facing. They can be found liable for punitive damages in federal actions.
All right, another question is, do you foresee any large claims in the state that could be significant due to social inflation?
We do have some claims that we're watching currently because of their status in litigation. I'm not really free to comment on them. But in the past, we have been lucky. We haven't had any of these huge verdicts, but we do see the possibility of something like this occurring in the state. In the future, we're always vigilant to monitor every claim and make sure that we're trying to handle them as best we can to avoid these types of situations.
All right, another one. How long does it take to take a case all the way through trial and appeal, and are the legal costs substantial?
Oh boy, the legal costs are substantial, and that is increasing exponentially. We're fortunate because we have the attorneys general that represent all of our state agencies, and they are probably the best deal for any lawsuit in the state as far as defense costs. But even with that, we pay out huge amounts for defense costs every year. I see this only increasing over time and becoming a bigger problem. Let's see, the other part of the question was what?
The other part of the question was, how long does it take the case to go all the way through trial and appeal?
Yeah, that can be, it can differ. In state court, they typically take a couple of years. In federal court, they can take as much as 4 or 5 or even 7 years. I've seen them go. So that's, the wheels of justice, I guess, do really grind slowly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning, and really, really well done. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate being able to talk to you all. Take care.
And David, we really appreciate your presentation. Very timely today.
Thank you.
Our next presenter today is Stuart Harmon, who is a shareholder with Plant Christensen and Canal. Stuart's primary practice areas are civil rights litigation and governmental entity defense. Stuart is a graduate of the University of Utah with a Bachelor of Science degree in Organizational Communication and Political Science and a Juris Doctorate from Appalachia School of Law. Stuart also served in the Utah Army National Guard as a counterintelligence special agent. Stuart will provide additional insight into qualified immunity and what we may expect if the Utah legislature or the courts modify or remove qualified immunity, as has occurred in other states. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Stuart. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Looks like I was muted. Thanks, Daryl. All right. Taylor, I may need your help. Can you see my screen?
I can indeed.
Okay, because I can't. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Let's see. Let me go to that.
Yeah, what we see looks perfect. It's the title slide of a PowerPoint, so what we're seeing looks great.
Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. Well, thank you to Olympus Insurance for the opportunity to do this today. Thanks, Daryl, for the introduction. This is certainly a little different doing this way. I'm sure other presenters have commented on this as well, that it's nice in one sense that I can't see how many people will fall asleep during my presentation. But it's also a little unnerving because I can't see how many people are making faces at me or watching. But anyways, hopefully we can get through this. I thought about trying to find, and I looked up to this morning trying to find some funny memes on Constitution Day, which it is today, and everything I found was very political, and I thought, I'm not touching any of those. The only one that I did find that was maybe appropriate was a picture of Queen Elizabeth saying, Happy Constitution Day, traitors. So anyways, Happy Constitution Day. I I did, before I jump into the qualified immunity defense issues, I did want to give just kind of a brief update that may be of interest to some of you on another case that I'm working on. It's an ongoing case, so I'm not going to share too much. But just some very brief background on this case is it was an evidence custodian for the police department who was placed on probation for various infractions of a department policy. And that probation included a 1-day suspension without pay and then probation for 1 year. This was an employee who'd been with the department for multiple years, and the letter of reprimand gave this employee or indicated that this employee had the right to appeal the probation or the disciplinary action, and no appeal was ever made. Sometime around 6 months or so later, the same employee was terminated for cause, and again given an opportunity to appeal the decision, but never appealed the decision. The lawsuit currently involves causes of action for breach of contract, breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, whistleblower violations, FMLA, and then also deprivation of due process. The court in that case has dismissed the state law claims for failure to exhaust the administrative remedies or failure to appeal the termination. And the state law claims include breach of contract, breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and also the whistleblower violations. The plaintiff, in preparing for trial, we had proposed some jury instructions regarding the plaintiff's probationary status because of the fact that she was still on that probationary status at the time of her termination. The plaintiff filed a motion to have the court make a determination on her probationary status, whether she was an at-will employee because of her probation, or whether that disciplinary action was invalid. The court found that the probationary status was not valid because there was no statutory right to appeal. So in Utah Code 10-3-1106, it discusses rights of appeal if a municipal or public sector employee is discharged, is suspended without pay for 2 days or more, or is transferred to a different position with less remuneration. And so in this case, the court found that because her suspension did not automatically trigger a statutory right of appeal, meaning that she was only suspended for 1 day, not 2 days, that it was a violation of her due process rights, and her supervisor did not have authority to place her on probation. So I tell you all that just, I guess, as a word of caution, those who have the ability to look at policies and procedures manual, it may be something to look at to ensure that disciplinary actions or possible disciplinary actions are clearly spelled out in your policies and procedures manual. If there is a provision that allows a person to an otherwise merit employee to be placed on probation, is there an opportunity for them to appeal, whether statutory or spelled out through ordinance with the city? So just some things to look at. I know it's a little aside from the topic I was given, but given that that's just happened in the last few weeks, I thought that may be of some benefit to others. So let's talk a little bit about qualified immunity. Those who participated in this conference last year might recall that I spoke on this topic in last year's conference last fall as well. As a reminder, qualified immunity shields government officials from money damages unless a plaintiff pleads pleads facts showing that the official violated a statutory or constitutional right, and that right was clearly established at the time of the challenged conduct. So government officials' conduct violates clearly established law when, at the time of the challenged conduct, the contours of a right are sufficiently clear that every reasonable official would have understood that what he was doing violates that right. So it's important to note that the clearly established right cannot be defined at a high level of generality, meaning that the right cannot simply be, for example, the language of the Fourth Amendment. It has to be really quite specific, and some of the things that we'll look at today will spell that out a little bit. But also, as a reminder, qualified immunity is not simply a defense, but rather it's immunity from suit. So it's not just, it doesn't just mean that you won't have to pay damages, but it's kind of the get out of jail free card. Now, qualified immunity, either the existence or the non-existence of qualified immunity doesn't have any impact on defenses to suit that would otherwise be available. So if immunity is not present, it doesn't have any impact on other potential defenses. And so again, the primary question in a qualified immunity case is whether it would be clear to a reasonable government official that his conduct was unlawful under the circumstances presented. So again, for those who participated in this conference last year, do you remember this slide? This slide stated qualified immunity post-Ferguson, Missouri, where we asked the question, what has changed? And kind of went through a few of these things. It's interesting to note that that post-Ferguson, and when we talked about this last year, we talked about the fact that there were strongly held opinions on both sides of the issue. We talked about the fact that the High Court's position is really quite clear in support of qualified immunity, and that there's no indication that qualified immunity would change anytime soon. We talked about some case law highlights and then limits to efforts to reform the doctrine, and just kind of a reminder of some of those limits. That not every questionable police act is a crime or can be made into one. Training and professional standards can impose a much higher bar for police conduct than oftentimes the criminal code can. And then typically, based on the case law, the benefit of doubt typically goes to police in close situations. The U.S. Supreme Court has emphasized that it does not want to second guess difficult split-second decisions by officers, nor are prosecutors, judges, juries, or grand juries likely to second guess in close cases. Now, again, what I'm talking about is where we were at this time last year. Police officers must often be on notice as to what actions are criminal. The Supreme Court has emphasized that the law must be clear enough that a police officer doesn't have to guess if he or she is acting illegally. Constitutional limits restrict the reach of some laws on police misconduct, and there's a high burden of proof on federal criminal civil rights law used to prosecute police officers. But of course, this really only becomes, well, not only, but this becomes an issue in part because of the fact that police officers are authorized to use force in situations where civilians may not be, and there's no obligation for police officers to retreat. So that was post-Ferguson. So now, qualified immunity post-Ferguson, post-George Floyd, post-Breonna Taylor, post-Jacob Blake, and probably others. What has changed? Well, clearly the news media has changed. The public sentiment or outcry has changed. But so far, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, so far, the position of the U.S. Supreme Court has not changed. And it has remained pretty clear, and there's no indication that it will change anytime soon. That being said, there are efforts to reform the doctrine of qualified immunity. So I know I touched on this a little bit. This is a little bit of duplication, but qualified immunity does not, I know we oftentimes and most oftentimes talk about it in the context of police, but it does not just qualify or apply to police officers, but rather to all government officials. They are immune from federal suits unless their actions violated clearly established legal precedent at the time. Some courts have required an extraordinarily precise match between the misconduct alleged in one case and in a prior one in order to find a violation of someone's constitutional rights. In most cases, appellate courts, circuit appellate courts, federal circuit courts that have not been or required as precise of a match have often been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. So despite ever increasing criticism over the past 6 months, the U.S. Supreme Court passed up on at least 7 cases this last June that would have allowed it to reconsider aspects of the qualified immunity doctrine. The court rarely explains why it is not taking cases and did the same this last June, with the exception of Justice Clarence Thomas, who recorded his dissent in connection with the decision to pass up one case stemming from a 2014 incident involving a police dog's bite of a homeless man, Alexander Baxter. So let's talk about just a little bit about the Baxter versus Bracey and Harris case. Nashville, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed denial of a motion for summary judgment from the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee in November 2018. The U.S. Supreme Court denied this last June, denied to hear this case. So a little background on this case. The Nashville police caught Baxter in the process of carrying out a burglary. He claimed he had already surrendered when the dog attacked. The Sixth Circuit in Cincinnati held that the police officers weren't liable because their conduct didn't violate a clearly established right. So let me give you the facts of the case. A neighbor caught Alexander Baxter burglarizing a house and called the police. Soon Baxter heard sirens and saw a helicopter looking for him and fled. First hiding in a car and then seeking refuge in a basement of a house he had previously broken into. Quality individual. But there Baxter hid between a chimney and a water heater while he watched and listened to the officers outside. Harris and Bracey were part of Nashville's K-9 unit, which is deployed for serious crimes such as aggravated burglary. The two of them entered the house with their dog, Ewo. Bracey announced they would release the K-9 if Baxter didn't surrender. Although Baxter heard the warnings, he stayed quiet. Harris, the dog's handler, repeated the warning. Again, Baxter remained quiet. So Harris released Ewo, who quickly found Baxter downstairs. The two officers followed Ewo into the basement and, according to Baxter, surrounded him. Baxter claims that he raised his hands in the air when they came downstairs, but he never responded to the officers' warnings or communicated about where he was hiding. Now, I should note that it never says if the officers saw Baxter with his hands in the air. And that last statement makes it sound as though they didn't, because he never communicated about where he was hiding. So that tells me that they didn't know that they did not see him or did not know that he was raising his hands in the air. Anyways, within 5 to 10 seconds of discovering Baxter. Harris released Ewo, this time to apprehend him. Ewo restrained Baxter with a bite. So the court said Baxter had been hiding before police found him, and the dog was well trained to only bite once. In those circumstances, Baxter's right to be free of excessive force wasn't clearly established. The Sixth Circuit held that while it was well established that a police dog couldn't be unleashed on a suspect who is lying down, there was no case addressing someone sitting down with their hands up, as Baxter said he was doing. So again, that goes back to that statement that I read just a moment ago that says, and if you can see my mouse on the top bullet, required an extraordinarily precise match. That sounds like this was not an extraordinarily precise match, and thus the Sixth Circuit said no go. They said that Baxter's case was more akin to a case that upheld the use of a well-trained canine to apprehend a fleeing suspect in a dark and familiar location. And it was less like a case that had found that police couldn't use an inadequately trained dog to apprehend without warning two suspects who were fleeing. So this is, that statement's a little interesting in that it does give the indication that that the training of the dog Ewo may have had some impact on that. And that goes to show how oftentimes one little fact can really change the outcome of a case. Facts are very important to these sorts of matters, and can take it from being extraordinarily precise to imprecise. And so the court went on to say that Baxter did not point the court to any case law suggesting that raising his hands on its own was enough to put the officer on notice that a canine apprehension was unlawful in these circumstances. So, kind of interesting. Again, Baxter had petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court for certiorari. Back in June, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear that case. But I should note that both Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Sonia Sotomayor have criticized the doctrine of qualified immunity. But in this case, the Baxter case, Thomas was the only dissenter when the court refused to hear that case. So let's see if we can see this. And that right there that just popped up is a copy of Justice Thomas's dissent, which we're going to touch on a few provisions of that because I think it tells us quite a bit about this. Critics of the qualified immunity doctrine have often called it a catch-22 that says to victims, in effect, heads, the police win, tails, you lose. And these two Supreme Court justices, Justices Thomas and Sotomayor, have repeatedly urged the court to re-examine the qualified immunity doctrine. What's interesting about that is that Justice Sotomayor is arguably one of the most liberal justices on the High Court, and Justice Thomas is arguably one of the most conservative. So that is a very interesting dichotomy in this case. Well, let's look at, and hopefully this will work. All right, success so far. We're going to look at this Justice Thomas's dissent a little bit closer. Let me just make this a little bigger so you can see it. All right, so again, this is Justice Thomas's dissent, and I've highlighted some provisions. Any of you are welcome to to pull this up. It's available to anybody who wants to see it. I'm happy to send you a copy of it as well if you'd like. Just email me after the fact. I'm only going to touch on the things on each page that I've highlighted. So just in the interest of time. So he states, I have previously expressed my doubts about our qualified immunity jurisprudence. Because our Section 1983 qualified immunity doctrine appears to stray from the statutory text, I would grant this petition. Oops. The text of Section 1983 makes no mention of defenses or immunities. And then he starts to go in and kind of break down some of the history of qualified immunity as it relates to Section 1983. He says, for the first century of the law's existence, the court did not recognize an immunity under Section 1983 for good faith official conduct. In the 1950s, this court began to ask whether the common law in 1871 would have accorded immunity to an officer for a tort analogous to the plaintiff's claim under Section 1983. And then he goes through and talks about a few different decisions and says these decisions were confined to certain circumstances based on specific analogies to the common law. Almost immediately, the court abandoned this approach in Shower versus Rhodes. And then he goes on to say, it based the availability of immunity on practical considerations about the scope of discretion and responsibilities of the office and of the circumstances as they reasonably appeared at the time of the action on which liability is sought to be based, rather than the liability of officers for analogous common law torts in 1871. So Justice Thomas, acting as a strict constructionist here, is saying, hey, if you didn't get immunity for it in 1871 when Section 1983 was first enacted, you shouldn't get immunity for it now. So then he goes on and starts talking about the Harlow versus Fitzgerald decision, which we spent quite a bit of time discussing last year, and says the court eliminated in Harlow from the qualified immunity inquiry any subjective analysis of good faith to facilitate summary judgment and avoid the substantial costs that attend the litigation of subjective intent. And if you recall, that at that point they made it more of an objective than subjective standard. And then goes on to say there likely is no basis for the objective inquiry into clearly established law that our modern cases prescribe. Regardless of what the outcome would be, we at least ought to return to the approach of asking whether immunity was historically accorded the relevant official in an analogous situation at common law. The court has continued to conduct this inquiry in absolute immunity cases even after the sea change in qualified immunity doctrine. And so there he's talking about the distinction between that subjective versus objective analysis in absolute immunity cases versus qualified immunity cases, and concludes by saying, I continue to have strong doubts about our 1983 qualified immunity doctrine. Given the importance of this question, I would grant the petition for cert. So that, again, is quite interesting how strongly Justice Thomas feels in opposition to where qualified immunity stands at this current time. That being said, there is enough of a majority on the High Court, even without one of its most conservative members, to continue to support the current position of qualified immunity in the courts. Now, that may be because, which we'll talk about in a minute, it may be because the High Court is waiting for Congress to act on this issue. they may believe that this is a legislative issue and reform should come from the legislature, not the court. And that's part of what their silence on all 7 of those cases, that's part of the message that silence sends. Let's talk for a minute about Justice Sotomayor. In one previous dissent, Justice Sotomayor said the court displays an unflinching willingness in allowing the lower courts to grant qualified immunity to police officers, but rarely intervenes when lower courts go too far. This one-sided approach transforms qualified immunity into an absolute shield for law enforcement officers. So Justice Sotomayor's position, she's repeatedly warned that the court's one-sided approach really sends an alarming signal to the public about the protections of police. In the case Sigler versus Abbasi in 2017, Justice Sotomayor wrote, "We have not hesitated to summarily reverse courts for wrongly denying officers the protection of qualified immunity in cases involving the use of force. But we rarely intervene where courts wrongly afford officers the benefit of qualified immunity in these same cases." Justice Sotomayor is a former prosecutor and the only former trial judge now on the Supreme Court. And she has been really the most consistent and vocal critic of the court's qualified immunity rulings. In 3 recent qualified immunity dissents that she made and 1 Fourth Amendment dissent, Sotomayor cautioned that the court's decisions were supporting a law enforcement culture that she said views qualified immunity as an absolute shield against liability for alleged abuses. So, congressional action. It's hard to say at this point what will happen, but with the recent firestorm of social injustice claims, and in the media and in our country, there's no question that members of Congress have felt an obligation to act and have started to act. So Democratic and Republican lawmakers have been pulling together their own versions of police reform legislation. A Democratic plan unveiled in the House back in the end of June by Representative Justin Amash of Michigan is called the Ending Qualified Immunity Act and would roll back qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. 64 representatives had joined as co-sponsors, and I should note that several members of Congress, all Democratic members of the House, have denounced the court's rejection that we were talking about a few minutes ago of those 7 cases that they declined to hear back in June, and have said, some have said, the Supreme Court's failure to reconsider this flawed legal rule makes it all the more important for Congress to act. Thus, it's no surprise that they are trying to act and trying to move forward in some fashion. There are also members of the Senate, Senators Markey and Warren and Sanders, who have proposed legislation in the Senate similar to that in the House in an effort to try and end qualified immunity as we know it now. Republican lawmakers have come out against abolishing qualified immunity, and at least in the past few months, the White House has signaled its opposition to abolishing qualified immunity as well. I do want to read a few statements, though, from Representative Amash that I think tell us a little bit about where Congress is on this issue. He says, this week, and this was back in June, this week I'm introducing the Ending Qualified Immunity Act to eliminate qualified immunity and restore Americans' ability to obtain relief when police officers violate their constitutionally secured rights. The brutal killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police is merely the latest in a long line of incidents of egregious police misconduct. This pattern continues because police are legally, politically, and culturally insulated from consequences for violating the rights of the people whom they have sworn to serve. That must change so that these incidents of brutality stop happening. Again, I don't know, what sort of traction this bill will get, or how far it will make it. But there's no question, you can smell it in the air. Change is a brewing. People are going to try and make change. And I'm not here to make this a political discussion at all, just to inform you kind of where things are at. But there's no question that obviously November may have some impact in what happens here. I've told you where the White House and most Republicans stand on this, but clearly, depending on what happens in November, that could change. One thing I did want to point out about this is, like I said, this bill would eliminate qualified immunity as, it says the defense of qualified immunity, but again, it would no longer make government officials immune from suit. But what I think is interesting is it says the bill provides the following: that under the statute allowing a civil action alleging deprivation of rights under color of law, it shall not be a defense or immunity to any such action that, one, the defendant was acting in good faith or believed that his or her conduct was unlawful at the time it was committed. Two, the rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution or laws were not clearly established at the time of their deprivation. Or three, the state of the law was such that the defendant could not reasonably have been expected to know whether his or her conduct was unlawful. The thing that's most troubling to me about that proposed legislation is the statement, it shall not be a defense or immunity. So not only does that seek to take away qualified immunity, but it also seeks to take away defenses to actions, which I believe goes too far. For example, when you look at just the first subset of that, it shall not be a defense to any action that the defendant was acting in good faith or believed that his or her conduct was lawful at the time it was committed. Clearly in cases not involving governmental immunity, let's take just a negligence cause of action, for example, you're always looking at, was the conduct reasonable? Good faith gets into that, some of those questions. So it is concerning that would not only take away immunity, but would bar some defenses as well. I should note that there is in late June, there was also a senator that proposed introduced a bill called the Reforming Qualified Immunity Act, which, unlike other acts, would not completely eliminate qualified immunity, but would rather state that officers could only be shielded if their conduct was, quote, specifically authorized or required by federal or state law, or if a court had previously ruled that their conduct was constitutional. So I think, something like that clearly would still give some immunity in certain cases, but would put some restrictions on it. So I don't think I have a whole lot of time left, so let me kind of hurry through this part. What would it mean for states? What would it mean for cities? Again, going back to this, if qualified immunity applies, money damages aren't available against the government employee, or official, even if a constitutional violation occurred. If qualified immunity doesn't apply, while the government employee or official technically is responsible for money damages, as I think has already been discussed here today, and as we've discussed in the past, the governmental entity typically indemnifies and defends its employee. So qualified immunity protects states and local governments from having to pay money damages that typically they're going to step in and pay for their employee or official. But it should be noted that eliminating qualified immunity is no surefire solution to police misconduct. And it should also be noted that courts interpret constitutional rights against police violence quite narrowly, and it's unlikely that they will provide redress for a great deal of police conduct, even without qualified immunity. So it's hard to say right now how much would change. There are a great deal of cases where we don't always fit a government official or employee into the nice neat little round or square hole for qualified immunity, and often these lawsuits have to go forward anyways. So it's hard to say really how much impact it will have. Plus, I think it's important to note that let me strike that that statement and move on to the next slide, because I think we'll get there. Let me just hit the second bullet point. The Supreme Court has held that police and correctional officers' use of force violates the Fourth Amendment when it is excessive. Police and correctional officers receive qualified immunity if it isn't clearly established that their use of force was excessive. According to the Supreme Court, while qualified immunity does not require a case directly on point, it does require that existing precedent must have placed the statutory or constitutional question beyond debate. Sorry, that wasn't the provision I was looking to read for you. But I think what's important to note is that even if the Congress does act and does change qualified immunity, we'll have to see how they change it. Do they eliminate it completely, or is it a reform? Does it eliminate qualified immunity and some of the defenses? It is important to note that even with the elimination of just qualified immunity, many of the defenses would remain, and that wouldn't change. So it would mean that we just simply have to go forward in defending the lawsuit. We can't get out immediately or early on in a qualified immunity sort of motion. And I should note that qualified immunity is typically only for the individual, not for the department. So it doesn't prevent claims against the department for or city, state for negligent hiring, negligent supervision, failure to train, things like that. So qualified immunity, it's hard because on one side of things you think, oh man, this is very detrimental if qualified immunity goes away, and it has been a very nice shield for cities, states, police departments, all of that. But I think at the same time we need to realize that I think even if it goes away, it isn't absolutely detrimental, unless of course Congress or some members of Congress completely get their way and do away with immunity and defenses, essentially making officers strictly liable for their conduct. I don't foresee that happening. I don't think that there's a possibility of that happening, but time will tell. So with that, I'm sorry, I wish there were more black and white answers. I don't know that there are really, there's a lot that's up in the air right now. The one thing, as I mentioned, that will go further than anything else and do more than any legislation is continued training with your departments, both with your police departments, other departments where government officials and employees have contact with the public and could be the named party in such a lawsuit. Training will do a great deal for your cities in protecting yourselves going forward. So anyways, I don't have anything else. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Stuart. Got a couple of questions in. First one is, what are your impressions of states like Colorado that have repealed qualified immunity at the state level?
Yeah, well, you know, that it's hard because you know, qualified immunity at the state level typically, I mean, it's hard to say. I would venture a guess that a lot of states are going to go that route. You know, in the current climate, and you know, whether it's because they truly feel that way, or they feel that it's politically expedient to do so. You know, as Dave Lund was talking about in his presentation, you know, there's just getting more and more of a
I'm not sure what happened, but thanks again, Stuart. Alan Balmano is the Employment Law Section Director in the Litigation Division of the Attorney General's Office. He previously worked in the Civil Rights Section and was the Section Chief of the Complex Litigation Section in the same division before spending 10 years in private practice. He's also a retired Army JAG officer and a member of the Bar of the U.S. Supreme Court, 10th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, Utah Federal District Court, and Utah State Bar. And Alan will be presenting on the legal liability and challenges arising from Title IX. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Alan. Thank you for being here. You may be muted right now.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
Now, if I can share my other screen, that will be, we'll have a slideshow presentation. Now, how do I make sure that you are seeing that?
So if you just go to display settings up at the top near the left.
Yes, let's see. People can see your screen. So let's see which screen I want to show you, because I've got two of them. I don't know which one you're seeing. Show screen. There we go. Let's see. I believe this is. I think. Okay, this is the one. Are you seeing a slide
Perfect.
that says? Okay, thank you very much.
Perfect. That's exactly what we want to be.
Great. So things change and nothing remains the same in the law, as you've just heard presented to you with regards to qualified immunity. I've been asked, and thank you, by the way, for the invitation to talk about what is happening under Title IX. It is, if you're working in the area, it is the latest and I think highest fastest moving new claim by plaintiffs' counsels. Everybody's discovered Title IX, and as we're going to find out, it involves quite a bit of different things. So let's just start really with the basics. What is Title IX? It provides that no person shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, we can talk about that, be denied the benefits of, we're going to see how that can be stretched and enlarged, and be subject to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, a lot of you think that Title IX is about education financial assistance, but I'll show you in a little while that receiving financial assistance is much broader than what the Department of Education can do. It's codified, the Title IX is codified at 42 USC 2000D-7, and it provides for remedies to the extent that the recipient, the organization, receives federal funds. Title IX is essentially a contract. Some people have said that's me trying to remember how to use a fountain pen because nobody writes anymore. But I have the last laugh because I actually still have fountain pens on my desk. But it's basically a contract between the federal government and the recipient not to discriminate based on gender. So and because it is that contract based on the spending clause, it's distinguished from Title VII, of course. Title VII is an outright prohibition against certain things, certain discriminatory acts, but this is actually a contract. You can get away from Title IX if you don't take federal funds. I'm going to mention Title VII a few times during this presentation because there are some similarities and there are some parallel, as you'll see, some parallel applications. And I'll point out where the similarities and where the procedural differences begin. So what does Title IX implies? Well, it implies a private right of action for both injunctive relief. Injunctive relief, of course, for government agencies, that can be problematic because it means someone else is telling you how to run your operations, and monetary damages, including attorney's fees. It's prohibition on intentional sexual discrimination. And of course, it encompasses, as we're going to see, sex discrimination when the recipient of federal fund is deliberately indifferent to sexual discrimination or to sexual harassment. Keep in mind those words, deliberate indifference, because we're going to talk a little bit about their application. Now, I know this isn't a school district or school organization. I know that you deal with many organizations, but I wanted to use a school district organizational chart to make this next point. The Title IX prohibitions apply to any program and activity. So when we talked about earlier, the slide that talked about any program and activity that receives federal fund, if you look at the lower right corner there, you see Director of Maintenance and Food Services. If that operation receives federal funds, your entire chart, your entire organization is subject to Title IX. So that's how broad, and that's the meaning of the broad application of Title IX. It's not just your food service person who's got a Title IX issue. Your director of special ed, of course, in a school district, those people are going to get federal funds anyway. But if you assume that this was the only place that was receiving federal monies, then everybody in that chart is subject to the Title IX prohibitions. So what activities does Title IX apply to? Education programs, that's what everybody kind of knows what we're talking about, right? A school's education program or activities, including locations, events, circumstances. The picture there is a school bus. Of course, the school bus is part of a school program of education. And if you take the kids on a field trip, this happens to be a picture of a field trip to a botanical garden. Gag, I would have gotten detention rather than go to a botanical garden when I was in that stage of my life. But that activity, of course, is going to be controlled by the school. You have substantial control over the respondent, over the context, and here again we're talking about primarily sexual harassment, but we'll also be talking about some other things in a minute. And you see there, building owned or controlled by a student organization officially recognized by post-secondary education. Our K through 12 don't have Greek rows, and they don't have fraternities and sororities, but our colleges and universities do, and those activities there are controlled by Title IX as well. So when we're talking about equal access to educational resources, opportunities, and benefits, that's important. And I'll give you an example. Little Susie is in 9th grade, and little Susie is a straight A student, but she gets into a class with some rowdy juniors and seniors who are being fresh with her and who are harassing her sexually, and her grades, because she really doesn't fit into that class, go from an A to a D. You have an example of the victim being deprived equal access to educational resources opportunity. That loss in grade is going to be evidence of that. Or you're going to see situations in which the student, and I'll give you a war story case in a few minutes, of a student that retained straight A's even in the face of some very serious and severe harassment. And of course, the school tried to take the position, well, look, she hasn't been denied any educational opportunities because she's still getting straight A's, and the courts did not buy on that. But I'll give you more background on that in a little bit. So obviously education, now you're going to say to yourself, well, good, I don't work with the school districts, I'm free and clear. Let me show you why you're not. Of course, let me explain the sexual harassment thing simply because it comes up a lot. As you know, the Department of Education and the federal level recently issued new regulations on how to deal with sexual harassment in the educational context. These new regulations were meant to add some due process to protect respondents, to protect people accused of having committed sexual harassment. And I can talk to that if you have the question a little later. We'll have time for questions, and I can talk more about that if you wish. Right now, I wanted to just give you the definition of sexual harassment. It includes, of course, the quid pro quo, conditioning the provision of a benefit or service in exchange for unwelcome sexual conduct. The quid pro quo, we all know what that means now. We've heard it in the news for months in various contexts. Unwelcome conduct determined by a reasonable person to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. Now, notice here, that's a little different from Title VII, which is severe, pervasive, or severe or pervasive. And this is one of the ways in which the new regulations have made it more difficult for colleges, say, to be able to find that certain conduct was liable, because it has to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. In the Title VII context, in the employment context, one incident of a severe act is sufficient. It doesn't have to be pervasive, pervasive meaning repeated over and over again. Here in the Title IX context, the rule has been made more difficult to prove the sexual harassment, and you see that in this particular definition. The third, of course, part of the definition: sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking. Those are all part of what is considered to be sexual harassment. And of course, we include in that domestic violence committed by a current or former spouse or intimate partner. It doesn't have to be within a context of a spouse. It includes stalking. So those are all the definition of sexual harassment. Title IX, of course, we all hear of Title IX as an equal opportunity in athletics. In Utah here right now, we have the famous Gordon case that is being tried as we talk today, which is girls football. And the plaintiffs in that case are saying that it's not enough to just letting the girls play on the boys football team if she wants to try out and make the team. There has to be a separate girls football program. Now, a recipient of federal monies that operates or sponsors interscholastic, intercollegiate, club, intramural athletics shall provide equal athletic opportunities for members of both sexes. We're talking about selection of sports, equipment, scheduling, travel, coaching, locker rooms, facilities, publicity. We've seen everything from, the boys baseball team gets to play on the nice field. The girls softball team gets to play in the old 1945 ratty field that has lumps on it, and that never gets mowed because the garden staff or the gardening staff never gets to it. Coaching, how come the boys get 6 coaches for their basketball team and the girls get 1 coach and then an assistant who's a volunteer? Travel, how come the boys get to stay at the Holiday Inn and the girls get to stay at the we'll leave the light on for you Motel 8 that has sketchy carpeting stains? So we've seen those kind of issues, and they are, broadly speaking, right on the Title IX concept of equal opportunity and equal funding and lack of discrimination. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that slide, other than to say that back when I was a professor at West Point, I used to work with the girls fencing team, and that was a lot of fun, except that they used to beat me up all the time because they were a lot better at fencing than I ever was. Title IX also extends to discrimination in employment, which is why I've been talking about Title VII. Now, I know you're telling yourself, oh, wait a minute, employees already have Title VII as a protection, and if they're an employee, maybe of the school or of the organization, they're not there to participate in the receipt of education. Maybe they're teaching, maybe they're supporting the educational mission. But no, the courts have said that discrimination in employment under any education program or activity operated by a recipient is you, the agencies that receive federal funds, which receive federal financial assistance. So Title IX broadly protects employees from intentional discrimination on the basis of sex in violation of Title IX. The Jackson Supreme Court decision of 2005 was addressing a claim of retaliation rather than sex discrimination, and the Supreme Court had no problem applying Title IX to retaliation against an employee, against an employer. When an employer acts in a way that effectively condones or ratifies a sexual assault, a jury may reasonably infer that the employer itself is discriminating because of sex. So very broad application, and the Title IX is another opportunity for employees, and we're seeing this in a lot of employee contexts. Now let's talk about why it's a little bit different. As you know, in the Title VII context, the employee has to file a complaint with the EEOC. In Utah, we have what's called the Utah Anti-Discrimination Act. So you have to file a complaint. Title IX, you don't have to file a complaint with anybody. You can go straight to court. Now, you might have some proof problem, perhaps, if you're the plaintiff, in showing the deliberate indifference. But if the person sexually harassing you is your boss, a member of management, then you don't have a big problem at all, because if management is doing it, then the agency is deemed to know about it. So there are some procedural differences, and this is where we're seeing Title IX being used by plaintiffs' lawyers when their clients come to them and they haven't gone through the administrative process of Title VII, of getting the right to sue letter from the EEOC, or from, in Utah or in your state, from your state anti-discrimination agency. They don't have to go through that process. They can go straight to court under Title IX. The other thing that Title IX provides an assistance to in the plaintiff's world is you don't have a 180-day statute of limitation, or if your state is a state that has a joint agreement with the EEOC, you might have a 300-day statute of limitations. But still, Title IX doesn't have that 180-day, 300-day statute of limitation. It has basically your basic state tort statute, which in most states I think is about 4 years. Certainly in Utah is 4 years. So you can see where Title IX in an employment context can be very appealing to the plaintiff's bar. And of course, as I've already explained, under the Title VII, if the employer is intended to include the employer's agents. So if you have management be the one who commits the violation, that is, you're deemed to know that. So what else? I found this. I put this little chart together, this little slide together, because it has a couple of things on it. One is the National School Lunch Program, which of course doesn't take money from the Department of Education. Most of Title IX is enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. Most of you will know what that is. It comes out of the Department of Education at the federal level. But here's the National School Lunch Program. The money doesn't come from the Department of Education. It comes from the Department of Agriculture. And here we have a situation in which there was a diocese, a Catholic diocese in the a state back east, and a Catholic middle high school. I'm not sure what a middle high school is, but I think junior high, some of us would call it. And they were recipient of federal financial assistance based on their participation in the school lunch program. And the Supreme Court had no problem, and the court has no problem saying, you know what, you get, that it wasn't a Supreme Court, it was a Court of Appeals, but you get tagged with Title IX, even though Title IX specifically exempts religious schools. So if you remember, it's a contract. If you're taking the federal money, then you're subjecting yourself to the federal regulation. So I was wondering what other programs other than schools take lunch money. If you have a program at a county level that's taking federal money for a lunch program, you might be subjecting yourself to Title IX issues. If you have this next part is the E-rate program. The E-rate program is universal access to internet, especially in schools and libraries, but it's operated by the Federal Communications Commission. If the Federal Communications Commission is giving one of your agencies federal money to provide internet access to libraries, county libraries, maybe, perhaps, maybe if you have a maybe an urban, not urban, but countryside resident. The words escape me now, right? If you have a countryside residential problem where people in the country aren't getting internet, and the kids, especially now in the days of COVID, aren't able to do their studies and their homeworks because of the availability or the lack of availability of internet, and your agency says, well, we're getting federal money, we're going to put in internet access, and you may very well be subjecting that agency to some Title IX requirements. Now, again, you know, if the internet goes equally to everybody, that's fine. But you know, if the boys are getting the internet and the girls are not, maybe you have a problem. Or if during this program, in which maybe people are laying the fiber optic on behalf of the city, and you get a sexual harassment issue amongst the employees who are busy laying the fiber optic, you have possibly gotten yourself a Title IX issue. Museums. I decided on showing you the Art Museum in Cleveland because there's a famous case that goes back a few years. But where the museum was receiving, not directly, but through a school system, was receiving federal assistance for an educational program. It operated for the local K through 12. So the K through 12 school district said, hey, museum, would you have a program for us? And here's some federal money because, you know, that would help you to put the program together. And of course, that federal money comes with the contract, and the museum was held to be subject to Title IX. It also operated a library and some other programs in conjunction with a local university. So if you have a museum, you know, that is maybe supporting a local university and getting some federal funds, the court was satisfied there that the operation of the museum qualified as an educational activity. And of course, I picked an art museum because I suspect that would be okay. But maybe there's other museums. If you've ever driven from across America, they have museums about everything in our country. Big Ball of Strings and Clip, the Paper Clip Museum, and so forth. And if your local museum is getting some kind of federal money, maybe through the local school district, then or maybe through the local college, then you're at risk of that museum. The Big Ball of String Museum might be subject to Title IX. Libraries and jails or prisons. I was asked why I put those two together, and I think it's because when I was a boy, I maybe mixed them up. I don't know. That's not true. Women prisoners sued under the Title IX for failure of the jail to provide equal opportunity within a federally funded education program. You know, prisons and jails receive federal funds, and they're required to provide to provide legal libraries, or at least some kind of legal resources. This particular jail had a really nice law library for the male prisoners. It had a bunch of stacked books in a broom closet for the ladies, and of course that was a violation of Title IX. The plaintiff, this is wording from the court, the plaintiff showed a complete and systemic denial of access to law library. The court agreed with plaintiffs that the standard for finding a Title IX violation is equality. So libraries, the same thing. If you have a library and if you're letting the boys read certain books but not the girls, that would certainly qualify. Or if your librarian if your librarian maybe gets sexually harassed or sexually harasses a client, that's all of that is part of the Title IX or part of the Title IX process. I want to share a couple of examples of the deliberate indifference. And again, I'm going to take this from a school, but it doesn't have to be in a school context. But this one is specific, especially egregious, and egregious enough that I want to show it as an example. There was a freshman student, and she was sexually harassed. One would say she was raped, not on campus, not at school. This was a high school student, not during school hours. This was a Saturday night at a party out away from school, and it was a classmate who had the party, and she was sexually assaulted and raped, then she went to school, and she told the school counselor, you know, this bad thing happened to me, and the school counselor say, just don't worry about it, sweetheart, just overcome it, leave the bad, the bad things behind. That didn't, I don't think that was very smart, but that was just the beginning. Turns out, of course, that freshmen in high school all have telephones now and cameras, and they all text and do whatever else. And pretty soon, some of the other boys in the class, in the freshman class, got to find out what happened, and some of them were offended and called her a whore and very nasty names, and others defended their friend, the guy who had assaulted her, and told her that she better not squeal, and so on and so forth. And the harassment was pretty ugly, and so she went to the school and said, listen, I'm getting all this harassment here. I was a victim, and these guys are picking on me. And the reaction was less than forthright by the leaders of that high school. They said, well, it doesn't happen, we're not seeing it, so I think you're exaggerating. I think you should just grow up and stop squealing on people. She went to a teacher. Things got progressively worse, and she kept making these reports. The school district kept doing absolutely nothing. Eventually, the parents got involved. Her parents got involved, and the school then took the action of trying to convince the parents not to go to the police, because that wouldn't look good. And frankly, who's going to be able to prove it? And it would be disruptive to the freshman class. Imagine the disruption to this young woman, to this young girl. And so that was, but they did make some accommodation. One of the concepts behind the sexual harassment process under Title IX is that the agency is supposed to make remediation attempts, right? And so what they started doing is telling the young girl, well, look, you can eat your lunch in the faculty lounge, because she was being harassed at lunch, and her friends weren't allowed to sit with her at lunch because they were being harassed by by the rest of the mob. And so then she said, look, I can't be in class with this man, with this boy who has done this to me. And so they said, fine, you can come in early and do your work, maybe come in after school and do your work. That's fine. And she kept her straight A's. She's the one I told you about earlier that kept her straight A's through this whole process that psychologically was so abusive to her. She began to cut herself. She began to do things and do some. And all this was reported to the people at the school, and no one had any concept that, oh well, we ought to do something here. And nothing was done. And then later in the school year, she had to come in and take tests. They wouldn't let her take the test early because, heaven forbid, that she might take the test at a time other than the rest of the classmates. So she was made to take the test with everybody. And of course, in certain classes, she had to sit in the same room. And I think maybe one time in the desk right next to the fellow who had raped her. When finally the parents said, okay, we're going to move her to a new, and this was mid-year, so you're talking about January, February by then. The parents said, we want to move to a new high school. The principal of the high school said, I refuse to cooperate. She shouldn't run away from her problems. I have to tell you, the court was not kind to the leadership in that school district and in that high school. Nor should they be. And so deliberate indifference is the concept that if management knows that something like this is going on and does not take reasonable action to put an end to the harassment, then they are deemed to have adopted the harassing behavior. I could tell you all sorts of other stories. Most of them are in the school context, but if you have, for example, if you have a county sports program that receives federal funds, and they put the kids on a bus because they're going to travel to the other county to play soccer or whatever, and something happens on the school bus that is taking them, then that falls within the ambit. So at this point, I think I should just ask for questions and see if any of you have any.
Thanks, Alan. I got a couple of questions here. Would a city that receives federal funds for public works or roads be subject to Title IX?
It's very interesting because it has to be based on some sort of educational activity, right? Because the language of Title IX, of course, is in educational activity. I don't know that public works would necessarily fall in that category, or roads, for example. But I can imagine a rural area where you're going to get specific monies to build a road to the school. Perhaps that might broaden the situation. I haven't seen that situation, but I can imagine some clever plaintiff's lawyer trying to make that argument.
All right. And have you seen a significant increase in sexual harassment claims against entities that are subject to Title IX? Yes. We're seeing many more claims of sexual harassment, both on the student-on-student or faculty-on-student, not so much on that, but faculty-on-faculty or staff-on-staff. One of the big cases that we defended in my office not long ago involved a teacher and a janitor, and ultimately what appeared to have been a consensual relationship at the beginning was later revealed to be less than voluntary, and the school district was deemed to be on notice.
because the victim reported to a secretary. And this is part of these new rules make very clear that anybody who is reported to, that puts the school district on notice, or in this context, it was a school district. So if your lunch lady is told, little Bobby is doing this to me, the school district is deemed to be on notice because your lunch lady has been told.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alan. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure.
And Alan, thanks again for a very good presentation and a good summary on Title IX. We appreciate all who have contributed to the Fall 2020 RISC Conference. The presentations, including recordings of sessions on Tuesday and today, will be available at riscconference.net. And most of the presenters are also going to make their slides available if you just want to preview the slides. Our next RISC conference will be scheduled in March of 2021. Depending on how things progress with the ongoing COVID situation, we'll advise approximately 100 days in advance whether this will be a webcast or an in-person conference. And once again, we appreciate everyone being part of the RISC conference, both on Tuesday and today. We really would love to be back together again, but also want to make sure that we're all staying safe and being protected as we're all working through the various things that COVID-19 has impacted us. We appreciate each of you and wish you a good day. And once again, we'll be advising on the RISC conference for spring, probably sometime around December or January. Thank you very much.